Welcome back to the class video for Module 9, in which we're looking at John Adams's A Defense of the Constitutions of the United States. We're going to jump right back in where we left off. Let me quickly reset the stage for you. And the kind of surface level, this essay is John Adams evaluating the relative advantages and disadvantages of a unicameral versus a bicameral legislature. Right? Legislature with one house versus a legislature with two houses, or the Pennsylvania model versus the New York model. He is a strong advocate for the latter and a critic of the former, but he faces this rhetorical challenge. The unicameral model is clearly, at least conceptually, more democratic than the bicameral model. The unicameral model treats the people as equal. The bicameral model divides the people into the rich and the poor. Well, the poor is not actually accurate, as we saw with the New York Constitution. The popular assembly had a minimum property requirement, and the Senate just a higher property requirement. But setting that aside, Adams's sort of debate challenge here, or argumentative challenge, is to try to show why the more democratic government, the one that is more consistent with Tom Paine's common sense or Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, why that is a worse government and a more elitist government would be a better government for the United States. The foundational principle here is whether good or bad, the legislature that is more consistent with the revolution or less, the unicameral model lacks balance, right? Everything is combined into one institution, and there's nothing to check it, to keep it within bounds. Now, Adams, because he is very much locked in a kind of Aristotelian framework, when he tries to think of what are the component parts that could be pulled apart from the unicameral model, how could we divide this thing so we'll have units to check and balance against each other, he's drawn back to that few versus the many, and he rejects the principle of equality. He advocates for the principle of natural inequality in order to identify this cohort called the natural aristocracy. Now, as we observe, this is not a particularly great move if you want to be popular in the aftermath of a democratic revolution, and that's one of the kind of millstones around Adams's neck, is that he ends up re-embracing aristocracy out of this foundational conceptual drive to create checks and balances. He urgently sees the need for checks and balances, and the only thing he can think of is this distinction between the aristocracy and the commons. That will set up for us in the final movement of the course, when we get to the Madisonian turn, the brilliance, the genius of the executive, legislative, judicial model is that it doesn't implicate, it doesn't infer this distinction between the rich and the poor. But we are not here yet, right? This is John Adams in the 1780s, and so his argument is fundamentally counter-revolutionary, right? And he's aware of it, and that accounts for the conceptual awkwardness of the argument that he's trying to make. So as we turn now back to the text, we're going to pick up of the next piece of the argument. We left off with this great paradox: can the majority be tyrannical, right? Is it conceptually possible to imagine the people tyrannizing themselves? In the next step of his argument, then, Adams is going to try to distinguish between what he'll call equal laws and laws that are in the common good. Direct democracy has the appearance of goodness because it embraces the principle of equality. But Adams is going to try to convince us that just because it adopts this appearance, that is the pro forma processes of democracy, that doesn't guarantee or even necessarily help towards producing laws that are actually in the common good of everyone. This is a difficult conceptual distinction to make, right? The laws that are the result of the process that most illustrates our core values, we want to instinctively embrace those outcomes as good because they are the product of this process that we believe in. So Adams, much like Locke in his attempts to define tyranny, and much like Dickinson when he was trying to make this distinction, yes, Parliament appears to have the constitutional authority to pass this act, but that doesn't mean that act is in the common good or in our shared interest. So Adams is going to similarly end up in a kind of due process argument. That is to say, yes, direct democracy checks all these boxes for the kind of process we want to see, but that's a different conceptual question than what kind of laws are genuinely in the common good. So let's pick up with that portion of the text now. Let's pick up here on page 6, on the left-hand column, the first full paragraph. Adams introduces then a new topic of discussion. To demonstrate the necessity of 2 assemblies in the legislature as well as of a 3rd branch in it to defend the executive authority, it may be laid down as a first principle that neither liberty nor justice can be secured to the individuals of a nation, nor its prosperity promoted, but by a fixed constitution of government and stated laws known and obeyed by all. So notice that we have 2 separate things here. On the one hand, we have liberty, justice, and prosperity, and then on the other, we have a fixed constitution and stated laws known and obeyed by all. They are not the same thing. That is to say, just because you have a fixed constitution and stated laws does not mean that you have liberty and justice, right? It's a necessary precondition. You cannot have liberty or justice without a fixed constitution or government, right? But just because you have a fixed constitution doesn't mean that that constitution guarantees you liberty. You can imagine a fascist government, an authoritarian, totalitarian government, having a highly fixed constitution with clearly stated laws that everybody obeys, but those laws are not written to preserve liberty or justice. It's a fixed constitution that deprives individuals of liberty. So these are 2 separate concepts. That's what Adams is trying to draw apart here. Now, it's not a hard metaphor to imagine a fascist government, but it's more interesting to consider, could a popular democratic government with a fixed constitution deprive people of liberty and justice? Come to the right-hand column of page 6, the first full paragraph there. Adams writes, I shall cheerfully agree with M. Turgot that it is very possible that laws, and even equal laws made by common consent, may deprive the minority of the citizens of their rights. A society by a majority may govern itself even by equal laws, that is, by laws to which all, majority and minority, are equally subject, so as to oppress the minority. It may establish a uniformity in religion. It may restrain trade. It may confine the personal liberty of all equally, and against the judgment of many, even of the best and wisest, without reasonable motives, use, or benefit. We may go farther and say that a nation may be unanimous in consenting to a law restraining its natural liberty, property, and commerce, and its moral and religious liberties too, to a degree that may be prejudicial to the nation and to every individual in it. Now, this is a much more difficult conceptual problem. Can you imagine a people going to the ballot box and, of their own free volition, of their own sense of their own agency, voting to deprive themselves of rights? Would those laws be democratic, right? If they were popularly affirmed, if they were genuinely the general will, if you will, But nevertheless, what the general will wanted was a deprivation of their own rights. It's that conceptual paradox or dilemma that Adams is looking for the vocabulary to describe, right? It's a nascent conceptual problem that he's trying to bring to the surface. And he essentially comes down to a kind of due process conclusion about that. That is to say, if it was popularly voted for, if the people genuinely wanted, then it would click off these boxes. That would be fixed constitutions, stated laws known by all, right? It would satisfy those kind of procedural requirements, but there's this other thing: would it actually be good for the people, right? Could they be wrong in their judgment about what's best for themselves? The next highlighted passage: these would all be equal laws made with common consent. These would all be acts of legitimate government. To take in M. Turgot's idea, then, we must add to Dr. Price's ideas of equal laws by common consent this other: for the general interest or the public good. So the primary distinction here is between legitimate and general interest or public good, right? These would all be acts of legitimate government, but they would not necessarily be good. He tries to elaborate on that distinction here in the following pages, right? So if we come to the first full paragraph on page 7, although there may be unjust and unequal laws, obedience to which would be incompatible with liberty, yet no man will contend that a nation can be free that is not governed by fixed laws. All other government than that of permanent known laws is the government of mere will and pleasure, whether it be exercised by one, few, or many. Republican writers in general, and those of England in particular, have maintained the same principle with Dr. Price, and have said that legitimate governments, or well-ordered governments, or well-constituted governments, were those where the laws prevailed. They have always explained their meaning to be equal laws, made by common consent, or the general will, that is to say, made by the majority and equally binding upon majority and minority. So there is a minimal criteria and then a minimal obligation, right? That comports with that minimal criteria. Yes, these are equal laws. And what does Adams mean by equal? Everybody got to vote on them. The majority was in favor. And therefore, the minority is obligated to obey the law. It is equally binding upon the majority and the minority. That's what is the minimal criteria. We all got to vote. You lost, so you got to go along with this rule. Adams is not disputing that, right? Yes, I am obligated to go along with this law, even though I think it's BS. For that exchange, we have merely satisfied the criteria of not being a government of mere will and pleasure. We have satisfied the criteria of a government of permanent known laws. And then he wants to try to affirm that distinction in these quotes from Aristotle, Sidney, Harrington, and blah, blah. One of the things that Adams tries to do is show you how smart and well-read he is. And so this is sort of characteristic of the defense of the constitutions. Nevertheless, he's trying to make that same distinction between the minimal procedural criteria that have to be met as opposed to goodness or in the general interest, in the common good. And so we come to this kind of summation of this section on the left-hand column of 8. We can start with, that first full paragraph that's not highlighted. It is true that laws are neither made by angels nor by horses, but by men. The voice of the people is as much the voice of men as the voice of a prince is the voice of a man. And yet the voice of the people is the voice of God, which the voice of a prince is not. The government of laws, says Aristotle, is the government of God. M. Turgot might have perceived in these writers that a government of laws and not of men was intended by them as a description of a commonwealth, not a definition of liberty. There may be various degrees of liberty established by the laws and enjoyed by the citizens in different commonwealths, but still the general will, as well as the general interest, as far as it is understood by the people, prevails in all that can be denominated free. So the voice of the people is the voice of God. Only the people can create sovereignty and create the legitimacy, the validity of governmental acts. But that is merely a commonwealth, right? You have merely satisfied the requirements to say your government is truly legitimate. That's not a definition of liberty. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily living in freedom. It just means that you have a legitimate or valid government. So the great question in the next paragraph on the left-hand column, bottom of the left-hand column of A, the great question therefore is, what combination of powers in society or what form of government will compel the formation, impartial execution, and faithful interpretation of good and equal laws so that the citizens may constantly enjoy the benefit of them and may be sure of their continuance? There is something more important than the affirmation of the people as the voice of God. It is that the government that they create, being valid and legitimate, aspires to this higher standard, the impartial execution, faithful interpretation, and so the citizens may constantly enjoy the benefit of them. The people, such as they are, ought to want a government that effectively works for them, even if that means, by implication, he can't say it explicitly, that they should have a smaller share of power in that government. If they're going to mess it up, in other words, is the inference. And that's obviously the next topic or theme or concept that Adams has to lay out. How can it be, if the people are the voice of God, why should not they then have complete power directly themselves? Well, the answer is that you can't trust the people because they're not that bright and they don't make good decisions for themselves. And that's the next theme that Adams has to turn to now. On the right-hand column of page 8, the first full paragraph, Adams writes, "In order to be fully convinced of this," that is, the necessity of a bicameral legislature, "we must take an extensive view of the subject, and the first inquiry should be what kind of beings men are." Now this takes us right back to both Locke and Rousseau's discussion of the state of nature, and indeed Tom Paine's portrait of man's nature in the state of nature. What kind of being is man? If man is rational and cooperative and agreeable and has a kind of innate compulsion towards social organization, then we should give him lots of power, right? But if man is irrational and aggressive and violent and innately antisocial and individualistic, then we need to restrain man's vicious impulses. And what's wonderful about Adams's description here is the essential Lockean duality of it. He thinks that man is both at the same time. Here he starts, the passions are all unlimited, and he identifies these three, the love of gold, the love of praise, and ambition. Now, man struggles with these vicious impulses in the highlighted passage on the left-hand column of 9. Men should endeavor at a balance of affections and appetites, under the monarchy of reason and conscience within, as well as at a balance of power without. They were intended by nature to live together in society, and in this way to restrain one another. And in general, they are a very good kind of creatures, but they know each other's imbecility so well that they ought never to lead one another into temptation. So notice first, particularly if you read Plato's Republic in Foundations, this man should endeavor at a balance of affections and appetites under the monarchy of reason and conscience. That is essentially the Platonic ideal, that your reason governs your appetites and your affections. but your appetites and your desires, your ambition, your desire for wealth are constantly undermining your attempts to live under the monarchy of reason. And if that's so, in the next highlighted passage, who would trust his life, liberty, and property to a madman or an assembly of them? That's the fundamental paradox. And so Adams can portray himself like Locke. If you remember our discussion of Locke and man's nature and the state of nature, Adams can portray himself as a kind of optimist here. He holds out the hope that at least some men can live under the monarchy of reason and control their affections and appetites. And he claims to have a kind of brighter, more optimistic view than all these other writers that he quotes. He quotes Machiavelli and Montesquieu and Swift and Junius. And we come to this summary here at the bottom on the right-hand column of page 9. Hobbes, Mandeville, Rochefoucauld have drawn still more detestable pictures. And Rousseau, in his Inequality Among Mankind, gives a description of a civilized heart too black and horrible to be transcribed. And we drew that contrast when we discussed Rousseau, if you recall, that difference between Locke's portrait of the state of nature or a man's pre-social state and Hobbes's and Rousseau's. Both Hobbes and Rousseau have very dark ideas about man's nature outside of society. We are, if you remember Rousseau, stupid and unimaginative animals. We lack reason. We lack morality or justice in nature outside of society. The question for Adams is not so much whether such dark impulses exist in man, but what's its fundamental cause? And we see here he's willing to give man the benefit of the doubt. Man is this way, but not out of wickedness. He says at the top of the left-hand column of page 10, shall we say that all these philosophers were ignorant of human nature? With all my soul, I wish it were in my power to quote any passages in history or philosophy which might demonstrate all these satires on our species to be false. But the phenomena are all in their favor, and the only question to be raised with them is whether the cause is wickedness, weakness, or insanity. In all events, we must agree that human nature is not fit to be trusted with M. Turgot's system of all authority in a single assembly. And so the purpose of the second assembly, of having two assemblies for Adams, is to allow this natural division within human nature to express itself institutionally. The popular house, the lower house, is going to embody all of our wickedness, weakness, and insanity, right? But the upper house, the separate house, has the possibility, at least, of embodying the better angels of our nature, if you will. On the right-hand column of page 10, then, Adams cites this famous essays or collection of essays by Lord Bolingbroke called The Patriot King, and these date from the 1750s. Bolingbroke is referring essentially to this natural aristocracy that Adams had identified earlier in the essay, and we can pick up on the highlighted passage not quite halfway down the right-hand column. These are they who engross almost the whole reason of the species, born to direct, to guide, and to preserve. If they retire from the world, their splendor accompanies them, and enlightens even the darkness of their retreat. If they take a part in public life, the effect is never indifferent. They either appear the instruments of divine vengeance, and their course through the world is marked by desolation and oppression, by poverty and servitude, or they are the guardian angels of the country they inhabit, studious to avert the most distant evil and to procure peace, plenty, and the greatest of human blessings, liberty. Again, as we saw earlier in his essay, we have this remarkable cohort. Now, it is an observation on the dilemma of human nature, right? To what extent are men reasonable, cooperative, and social? To what extent are they aggressive, irrational, violent, antisocial? if this group is necessarily a small group, this guardians of their country, this natural aristocracy, then that's roughly the percentage of human nature that is agreeable and rational, right? It is the smaller part from this conception. Nevertheless, they're going to inevitably be the most powerful. Right? Because they have the greatest skills and the greatest talents and intelligence and natural attributes. And so we can either capture them for good, or we can leave them to their own devices outside of society, to be abused by society or to come into conflict with society if we don't incorporate them with it. And so we can choose whether to recruit their talents for good or for evil. In the final passage there at the bottom of the right-hand column. If there is then in society such a natural aristocracy as these great writers pretend, and as all history and experience demonstrate, formed partly by genius, partly by birth, and partly by riches, how shall the legislator avail himself of their influence for the equal benefit of the public? And how, on the other hand, shall he prevent them from disturbing the public happiness? I answer by arranging them all, or at least the most conspicuous of them, together in one assembly, by the name of a Senate. By contrast, if we do not recruit this natural aristocracy on the side of good and in favor of supporting the government, the result is inevitably going to be civil war, Adams thinks, on the final portion of this first section of the reading, and the highlighted passages on the left-hand column of 11. But if these were all admitted into a single popular assembly, the worst of them might attain the ascendancy of all the rest. In almost the whole of this aristocracy will be one class. There'll be another set of members of middling rank, and then a third class, every one of whom will have his leader among members of the first class. And so you see Adams's conception here inevitably drifting towards this Aristotelian trilogy, the one, the few, and the many, just as we saw in his earlier example. And the Roman precedent is what is foremost in Adams's mind on the right-hand column of 11 at the top. But if they divide, each party will, in a course of time, have the whole house, and consequently the whole state, divided into two factions, which will struggle in words and writing, and at last in arms, until Caesar or Pompey must be emperor and entail an endless line of tyrants on the nation. It is the classical history that is Adams's reference point. He is referring back to that Aristotelian wisdom that you must have an appropriate check and balance, that he can only conceive of those checks and balances as the naturally wise and just and enlightened versus the vicious and the aggressive and the irrational, shows that he can't penetrate the principles of social contract theory, the kind of prevalent mode of 18th century thinking about politics, and advance beyond that trap. He's caught in that collision between the two. So let's summarize and return back to our illustration. So the unicameral model, exactly because it is equal, simple, and natural, lacks the sophistication, if you will. It lacks the internal component parts necessary to manage the forces of nature. It is too simplistic in its assumptions about human nature. It combines everybody together in one. And by combining everybody together in one, it virtually ensures civil war, is Adams's argument. On the other hand, the bicameral model, although it appears to make a compromise on the principle of equality, is more durable and better designed to ensure laws in the common good. It does this by separating the good portion of the people from the bad portion of the people. By containing our vicious impulses within one branch, it allows our good impulses expressed in the other branch to triumph and to lead the way. Consider how different this is than Tom Paine's portrait. Remember from Tom Paine, everything about our individual selves and our urgency to join into society was good and wholesome and wonderful. It was that terrible government that embodied all the bad qualities. And so as long as we were in opposition to government, we were on the side of good. That is a wonderful form of rhetoric or conceptualization if the goal of your writing is to urge people to pick up their muskets and rush off and sign up for the Continental Army or the state militias. It tells us that we are good and that our anger and resistance comes from a just and rational place. Adams's portrait here is decidedly less popular. It is less complimentary to the people at large, but it's also more sophisticated in that he is urging us to take accountability for our own vicious impulses. He's telling us you can't externalize it onto a foreign government. It is within us. If you want to think of yourself as good, then come join the natural aristocracy. We'd love to have you as part of the natural aristocracy, but we're engaging in a kind of romantic poeticism to imagine that everything about the people is good and we can externalize everything that we think is bad onto this foreign object called the government. We are the government. The government is comprised of us. So Adams doesn't have the language yet to describe that isn't insulting to people, right, in the aftermath of a democratic revolution. And that's the great kind of vulnerability or weakness of this writing. But conceptually, he's calling the revolutionary generation to account. He's calling them to account for their kind of swarmy, homogenized, romantic view of man's nature and asking them to explain the results of the legislation of the revolution if it's not our own viciousness. And we'll talk more about those laws in the background to the federal constitution in Module 9. Or Module 10, excuse me. Here we have one more step to take in Adams's conclusion that will set up the transition to a discussion of a federal constitution. Thus far in the essay, Adams has been talking about state constitutions and the necessity of bicameral legislatures for those state constitutions. In the conclusion to the excerpt I've given you, he's going to apply that model to the federal question. And of course, he's on the opposite side of the issue. The Continental Congress is a unicameral legislature, and he's going to argue that that is appropriate, but also try to apply his model that it will end up in civil war if the Continental Congress ever assumes sovereign powers, which is, of course, exactly what the federal constitution is going to propose. So we're going to look in the conclusion to Adams's essay here, and we'll try to apply this same model to the national level, but try to reach the opposite conclusions and argue that his theory is still true. So let's turn back to the text and the final movement. In his conclusion, Adams claims to have demonstrated that these three branches of power have an unalterable foundation in nature, that the fundamental division is between legislative and executive, where the executive is subordinate to the legislative, and then there is this fundamental division in the people that's expressed in two branches of the legislative. And Adams introduces the final conceptual problem in that last sentence on the bottom of the right-hand column of 11. This is applicable to every state in America in its individual capacity, but is it equally applicable to the United States in their federal capacity? And the answer is no, because the federal government, or the Continental Congress, is a fundamentally different kind of government than the state governments at the top of the left-hand column at 12. The people of America and their delegates in Congress were of opinion that a single assembly was in every way adequate to the management of all their federal concerns, and with very good reason, because Congress is not a legislative assembly, nor a representative assembly, but only a diplomatic assembly. The Continental Congress, in other words, is not a sovereign government for the reasons that we saw in our analysis of the Articles of Confederation, because it claims no sovereign power. It leaves all powers to the states, that it's merely a league of friendship, that it lacks a taxation power, for example, that it lacks a federal judiciary and has to rely on this absurd, ridiculous mediation process. That every state has an equal vote, no matter their size and property at stake in the taxation policies or the revenue policies of the Continental Congress. In all these ways, the Continental Congress is not sovereign, and that's what Adams means here when he says it's not a legislative assembly, nor is it a representative assembly. It's only a diplomatic assembly. So think of like a NATO council of different European nations in America all coming together. They represent sovereign nations. Their sovereignty is not compromised by their attempt to form an alliance and cooperate. For that reason, then, Adams thinks, one assembly, a unicameral model, that's fine. They're not claiming to exercise the powers of the people. But if that were to change, things would be very different. And that's the significance here at the top of the right-hand column of 12, is this advocacy for more powers. He writes, Dr. Price and Abby Demably are zealous for additional powers to Congress. Full power in all foreign affairs and over foreign commerce, and perhaps some authority over the commerce of the states with one another may be necessary. And it is hard to say that more authority in other things is not wanted. Yet the subject is of such extreme delicacy and difficulty that the people are much to be applauded for their caution. Again, we will come to this in the next module. The proposal that the new federal constitution will create a government that has the power to tax, that contains a federal judiciary, the other attributes of sovereignty, is profoundly controversial in the post-revolutionary period. So what Adams is saying here is, I realize that the central government is weak and you foreigners are frustrated in trying to negotiate treaties with the United States because the government you're negotiating with doesn't have the power to enforce its rules on the state. So it's hard to say that more authority in other things is not wanted. Adams is conceding, right? Yet the subject is of such extreme delicacy and difficulty. Right? It is not easy, and if we were to invest more authority in the central government, then 100% a unicameral model would lead to its own demise. And that premise then allows him to repeat his model. What the final pages here that describe again this descent into civil war. This is now the third time Adams has described this process. Right? He says at the bottom of the right-hand column of 12 in the highlighted passage, it will be a proper conclusion of all our speculations upon this, the most interesting subject which can employ the thoughts of men to consider in what manner such an assembly will conduct its deliberations and exert its power. That is to say, if we were to continue with the unicameral model, which I previously had said is fine because the government is not trying to exercise any sovereign powers, let's then conclude our speculations with what would happen if such an assembly did have substantive governmental powers. And that setup then allows Adams to repeat his portrait of cataclysm, right? He says at the bottom of the left-hand column 13, in just one sample, all the officers of revenue, police, justice must be appointed in the same way. Ambassadors, consuls, agents to foreign country must be appointed to by vote of assembly. But this is not all. The army, the navy, revenue, excise, customs, police, justice, and all foreign ministers must be gentlemen, that is to say, friends and connections of the rich, well-born and well-educated members of the house. And then he goes on to the administration of justice. All of this cataclysm would result if we were to have a single unicameral legislature at the national level invested with sovereign powers, that is doing all these things: navy, revenue, excise, customs, police, justice, foreign ministers, etc. Culminating in this final summation of the ruin to follow on the right-hand column of 14. In a word, As long as half a score of capital characters agree, they will gradually form the house and the nation into a system of subordination and dependence to themselves, and govern all at their discretion, a simple aristocracy or oligarchy in effect, though a simple democracy in name. And that is reflective of these foundational principles he's been trying to persuade us of since the beginning of the essay. In the final highlighted passage there in the conclusion, all nations, under all governments, must have parties. The great secret is to control them. There are but two ways, either by a monarchy and standing army, or by a balance in the Constitution. Where the people have a voice, and there is no balance, there will be everlasting fluctuations, revolutions, and horrors until a standing army with a general at its head commands the peace, or the necessity of an equilibrium is made to appear to all and is adopted by all. We end here on this passage because we're going to come back to this when we read Madison and then Publius. This is the essential Madisonian insight. But it's going to require a reconceptualization of the vocabulary. Adams's problem here is the solution, his solution to restoring equilibrium is obnoxious to the principles of the revolution, to democratic equality. His solution to the problem of equilibrium is to hoist up a particular section of the people as the good, the natural aristocracy. We will see Madison and Publius using exactly these same metaphors, but through the language of executive, legislative, and judicial, and also the forms of representation. The different houses are going to come to represent different things, not the rich and the poor, as we'll see in the final section of the course. The main thing to take away from Adams here in the revolutionary section of the course is both that he is essentially right, right? That his analysis is correct, but his rhetoric is obnoxious to the period that he's writing in. There has to be a different kind of conceptual vocabulary created that can both satisfy the values of the revolution, but also observe Aristotelian principles of checks and balances. And that, the creation of that vocabulary, is the primary focus of the final movement in the course, beginning with the next module, Module 10.